Hello, welcome to the On the Record portion of the Rockbridge Report. I'm Cameron Steele. Joining us today is the Assistant Business Editor of the New York Times, Gretchen Morgenson. Thank you for joining us today.
Sure, Cameron.
First, I wanted to talk to you about your wide writing in the business and financial sectors. You've been writing consumer-oriented stories about the problems in the financial sector, including executive overcompensation, for years before anyone else. Is it safe to say that you saw the financial crisis coming?
I don't think I saw it coming to the degree that it, really overwhelmed the economy and really the markets just tanked. I did not see that coming, Cameron. What I saw coming was certainly a slowdown in the kind of mania for mortgages, for mortgage securities, the kind of credit binge that we really just went through. You knew that was going to end up badly because it was a lot of people chasing this idea that house prices would never go down, that you can invest in these securities without any fear of losing money. And anytime you have this kind of conventional wisdom that nothing can go wrong, you ought to be very alert to the problems that could go wrong. So I certainly didn't have any idea how bad it could get, but I did start writing about the mortgage crisis in early 2007, thanks to some very vigilant sources that I had who were pointing me to it, saying this is going to be bad.
Mm-hmm. And in a recent column, you wrote that one reason we got into the crisis was because borrowers entered mortgage agreements without realizing the kind of debt they were incurring. And then many times even banks didn't understand that these borrowers wouldn't be able to repay that. To what extent has this problem been fixed? Is it continuing today? And what still needs to be done in your opinion?
Well, we all know the stories of, borrowers who wanted to reach for that bigger house. They wanted to be able to afford, their dream home. And so what they ended up doing was taking on more debt than they really could afford, because there were mortgage products that had very low initial interest rates that made it seem like it was affordable perhaps, but that ratcheted up to higher levels later on. And so when that whole changeover occurred, then borrowers realized they couldn't, make the payments, and so started defaults, foreclosures, etc. What's happened now is that really there's very little lending going on at all. So the problems are not continuing. What's happened is the banks have just completely pulled back on lending. They're not making any loans. The commitments that they've already made to people, either through home equity lines, credit card lines, etc., they're even trying to pull back on when they can. So there really aren't these problem loans being made anymore, with the exception of some of the government loans that are being made to try to encourage housing to kind of get back off the mat. But we really aren't seeing commercial banks with the reckless lending now. We're seeing them completely pull back on lending, which is why the economy is in such a terrible strait, because you can't have an economy grow with banks not doing any lending.
So how do we encourage lending, but lending done properly?
This is a key issue, and it's a great question. To encourage lending, the banks have to have a cushion for losses that are still going to come onto their books. We have still not emerged from this credit binge. We have had almost 3 years now of what I would call an awareness that this was a big problem, but we still are seeing losses tick up at the banks, particularly credit card losses. We're pretty much through maybe the mortgage part of the crisis, but now we're into credit card loans, consumer loans, that kind of thing. So we're still seeing losses tick up. So as long as banks are increasing the losses, registering more losses, you really are not going to see a lot of lending take place. Now, your second part of the question is really interesting. That is how to make sure that banks are going to lend responsibly. And, I would initially have said, well, isn't it in their interest to lend responsibly? Isn't it amazing that they would not lend responsibly? Well, what happened was the whole idea of due diligence when you make a loan was removed from the system because these loans were packaged into securities and sold down the line to other investors. So the normal relationship you had with your bank, where your banker, your local banker gave you your mortgage, hoped you would repay it, you had that relationship, was really by the boards. And so now it was owned, this loan was owned by someone else who had no understanding of what was in the loan, who didn't understand you, the borrower, and the banker doesn't care because it's off here on somebody else's books. So that broke down the due diligence practice for centuries, really, of lending money to someone you know and hope it will be repaid. We have to get back to that kind of a mentality where the person who makes the loan is going to take care to make sure that it will be repaid.
And would you say that fixing that due diligence is the biggest issue facing the financial industry today, or what would be the biggest issue right now?
I think the biggest issue facing our entire economy right now is, and certainly the financial world is, how to resolve institutions that are too big to fail. Institutions that are deemed to be too important, too interconnected, that if their failure occurred, that other failures would occur because of relationships that we're not aware of until problems hit. This is the crucial central problem that our leaders in government have not yet dealt with. In fact, after the crisis, many companies are even larger than they were in the years leading up to the mortgage crisis. And so we are even at more peril to an institution that is too big to fail than we were prior to this crisis. So when you have a situation like Citigroup, where the taxpayer has given them $45 billion in TARP money, the taxpayer has helped to ensure a pool of assets of about $266 billion. You know, there's some idea here that we may never be repaid. And so we've got to resolve companies that are that big that the taxpayer has to come in and save them if they get into trouble.
And as far as business journalism goes, do you think that business journalists today are missing out on that as the bigger issue, as the context behind all of this? I know in a recent column you quoted a University of Maryland law professor who said that while executive overcompensation is bad, it's really the sideshow to this casino-like economy. So do you think that that's not being portrayed by journalists correctly? Or?
I think that once this story moved to Washington, it became much harder to cover. The story of the credit binge, the foreclosures, the mortgage securities that went bad, when that was in the domain of a business reporter, it was easier to cover. And this is kind of counterintuitive. You think that the government's going to be more open than, say, a company is or a lender is, and it's absolutely false. The